pertama. Bapak saya pindah.
Hai Kasper.
In the meantime, maybe we can, kind of having chat among us, kind of networking, because I know that some of you have been knowing each other for some times, but maybe has limited time to meet. So this is the time while waiting for our resource person, just for another couple of minutes.
Good to see you, Paul. Thanks for inviting me.
Good to see you, Kasper. Looks younger.
Not sure. It's been a while, huh?
Been a
5
while.
years or so.
Yeah. It's a long time.
Yeah.
But you stayed in China right now.
Yeah, I moved back in 2017
Okay.
from Hong Kong. Yeah.
So staying in Shanghai, live in Shanghai or?
In Shanghai, yes. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Akan membagikan tips bagaimana menjaga tubuh kita supaya tubuh kita itu tidak sakit selama di rumah. Halo, apa kabar semuanya? Bisa 2-3 kali, lamanya adalah sekitar 10-15 menit.
Okay, I think since it's already 5 minutes past 2, then we can start our discussion today. So welcome everyone to this series of discussion that we have. This is as the Indonesian Renewable Energy Society or Masyarakat Energi Terbarukan Indonesia. It's basically where people in Indonesia that has a interest and concern about renewable energy is having a discussion and meeting to support renewable energy in Indonesia. So this is one of the discussion that we have every Friday during this pandemic, because we just realized that in fact with the pandemics and everyone is staying at home, it's a good opportunity for us also to have this kind of discussion, to share our knowledge, to share our concerns, and also at the same time try to find like solutions toward the issues that we are having and facing at the moment. For today, we would like to share or we would like to get sharing from our resource person on the carbon pricing, because carbon pricing has been becoming more and more how do you call it, like on the agenda because of its importance in not only to achieve our NDC, but also maybe if we look at for a much longer term, then it's also a good way for us to have a low carbon development kind of thing in every countries. And of course, then at the end, internationally or globally, then we will be able to achieve the target of the Paris Agreement at least. So today we are expecting representative from the Ministry of Environment and Forestry to share with us the progress, because currently the Ministry of Environment and Forestry is in the process of preparing legislation and also regulation, sorry, and also policies related to carbon pricing in Indonesia. So we are thankful that we will have Ibu Laksmi Dewanti from the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, but I think she will be a bit late because she was in another meeting. Hopefully the meeting will be finished soon and Laksmi will be able to join us here. And we would like also to get input and also some experiences from our colleagues. We have my colleague Angela Kalhauge from the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, right, Angela? That will share with us what happened on carbon pricing, what is it that we need to have an effective carbon pricing implementation, and what happened at the global level. And then after that, we're gonna have also our colleagues from UNDP Indonesia, Mbak Verania or Mbak Rara, that will share also with us the views from UNDP on this issue on carbon pricing. And then we will have my colleague also, Aryani from South Pole, Indonesia, that will also share with us what is the role of offset basically in the NDC implementation. And then last but not least, of course, we will have Kaspar Shike that will share with us also and update us on what happened with I know this China ETS is something that maybe a country like Indonesia will be able to learn a lot because of the if I can say, maybe the nature is not 100% similar, but in a way both of us are developing countries and the big countries, and we have so many provinces as well similar to China. So now we would like to hear that also from Casper. And on top of that, from all the resource person, we would like also to hear your views and your input to the process that currently being undertaken in Indonesia to prepare the carbon pricing. So without further ado, I would like to invite Pak Surya Dharma. Pak Surya Dharma is the chairman of IRES METI to give his remarks so that we can start our discussion for today. Pak Surya, time is yours, Pak.
Ya, terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for you all and welcome to the this session, METI talk, which is conducted every Friday afternoon. So this is this session specifically mentioned on the carbon pricing.
Maybe they also clean the.
Is it okay, my folks? Okay.
We can hear you.
Yeah. So the specific issues raised today is on carbon pricing, because this is the one that we are discussing very intensively among stakeholders between Ministry of Forestry and also Minister of Energy with the renewable energy stakeholders, because the contribution of renewable energy is much depend also on the carbon pricing to achieve the NDC target. So as has been mentioned by Bu Kuki, thank you Bu Kuki to moderate this session this afternoon, and thank you all to all the participants, specifically to the our guest speaker from China, from South Pole, from UNDP, Mbak Rara, etc. Thank you all and welcome to this session. Hopefully this session will be used for not only for METI, for Indonesia Renewable Energy Society, but also can contribute to the Indonesia in the near future. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you, Pak Surya.
Yeah.
Colleagues, we are lucky. We are on time. We already have Ibu Laksmi Dewanti from the Ministry of Environment and Forestry that just joined us. Thank you, Ibu, for like having your time to share with us on what happened with Indonesian preparation for having the carbon pricing in Indonesia. Ibu Laksmi, you want to share your screen by yourself, right?
Yeah, if I may.
Ya, sebentar ya Bu. Sudah bisa, Ibu?
Oh, okay. Am I allowed to do so now?
Ya,
Okay.
kalau sudah bisa.
Actually, I'm
Please, Bu.
waiting for your sign. Okay.
Please, Bu.
So it's my turn, but Bu Kuki, or you gonna to have another introductions, please, so
No,
to do so.
It's Ibu Ami's turn.
Okay.
So we're gonna have if you have enough time, Bu, we're gonna have 20 minutes for you to share the information, the updates, and then maybe we're gonna have like 10 minutes for clarification questions. So the time is yours, Bu.
Okay, Bu Kuki. Thank you. No, I think I lost my camera. Let me stop sharing the screen first, and then let my camera on, so you can see my real face.
Yeah.
Actually, it's not too different with my photos. I'm using a same dress actually with my photo. Okay.
Halo, Mas Said, bentar. Mungkin ada baiknya.
Ya, silakan Bu.
Okay. Thank you, Ibu Kuki, and thank you, colleagues from METI. So a very good afternoon. Hope we all in a good health during this COVID-19 pandemic. I'm told to use English in these discussions. However, I talked, I texted Ibu Kuki. My guess is most of the participants will be Indonesians. So let me combine my language. My presentations, not too many. It's only 6 slides. It's all, are all in English. So I will combine the language when I'm explaining my slides. Again, I really appreciate, I mean, on behalf of the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, I really appreciate these invitations, and we very much regard this invitation and this opportunity to listen more to stakeholders, especially colleagues who already have years of experiences in carbon pricings. So it will be our honor to listen to you during these discussions. Ibu Kuki said that if I have enough time, yes, I have to be honest that I'm sharing my ears now with different with other meetings, but I'll try my best to stay on listening all the discussion. So if I need to jump or to respond to the questions later on, I mean outside my sessions, I'm happy to do so if possible. Bapak-bapak dan ibu-ibu sekalian, so colleagues, participants and speakers, let me share with you the status. Okay, it's a misspell. The status of development of the presidential decree on carbon pricing in Indonesia. For all Indonesian colleagues, we are using nilai ekonomi carbon as to translate carbon pricing in Indonesia. So the title will be in Indonesia. I mean, the title of President's Degree will be in Indonesia. So we use nilai ekonomi carbon as to translate carbon pricing. We also adopt our own working definitions based on the discussion, based on input from various resources, including the references. So we have the working definitions. We may have different understanding or different definitions in the words or glossary that we are using in the draft, but we are willing to discuss with all stakeholders in ensuring that we all in the same perception and in the same base of understanding toward this draft. As you may already aware that the beginning of this month, there is the cabinet's meeting, and Ibu Siti Nurbaya, Minister of Environment and Forestry, has also tell publics that the government is now initiating so-called government regulation, presidential regulation or presidential decree on nilai ekonomi carbon or carbon pricings. The background is very simple. Yeah, this slide, I mean, you already know this slide, right? I mean, various reports say that climate change is a clearly an urgent challenge. So to be able to ensure that we will meet the challenge, we have to have various efforts and government in this regard needs to have a mix of policy intervention to be able to address the negative impact of the climate change through the adaptations as well as mitigations actions. And we have the NDC like other countries. We Indonesia have submitted its nationally determined contribution, and we all know maybe Ibu Kuki or Pak Dharma at the introduction has already mentioned about the target of NDC. We have 29% unconditional emission reductions against business as usual scenario. And up to 41% as a conditional emission reduction subject to international support. So we are very committed in ensuring that the NDC implementation will be able to reach the target by 2030. I mean, this is the mandatory pledge of Indonesia to reduce greenhouse gas emission. So we shall try our best to achieve the target. Maybe unlike other country, Indonesia put adaptation as important as mitigation in our NDC. So please don't be surprised if in this regulation we also put some provisions on adaptation. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I will not share the draft during this discussion because it's still dynamic. I mean, the discussion is still going on, and we should not prejudice the final outcome. So, forgive me if not able to share the draft. There are messages in our NDC that we need to integrate the climate imperative into structural reform and broader national development strategy. We need to speed up a collective and national effort toward full implementation of Paris Agreement, and we need to realize greenhouse gas mitigation potential across the economy. And most importantly, that we believe and well, I think we don't have any other option than to say that this is a time for action. Jadi ini adalah waktunya untuk kita bekerja, ini waktunya untuk kita dapat memobilisasi seluruh sumber daya yang ada. So it's time for action and it's time to mobilize the resources. Jadi Bapak-Bapak dan Ibu-Ibu, penyusunan draft regulasi ini juga merupakan bagian dari upaya untuk bisa memobilisasi berbagai macam sumber daya. So the development of this presidential regulation, it's part of our commitment to mobilize all potential resources. I will not explain the whole things in this slide. I'm using this slide from my colleagues Ministry of Finance. I just would like to mention that we are very committed and serious in saying that we're gonna to mobilize all resources. So we are doing something intervention on our fiscal policy, namely budget tagging, climate action tagging, both for mitigation and adaptations. And we also develop or improve access to the global finance resources like Green Climate Fund, global environmental facilities, and other resources. We also need to ensure that our programs and intervention is attracting private sector investment. And the other one is we are developing sets of innovative financing instruments. So when we talk about the carbon pricing, we are talking about this four strategy. We would like to have the carbon pricing regulations to also to mainstream the climate change importance into the fiscal policy. We are trying to use the carbon pricing regulation to improve our access to global finance. We are consider that the carbon pricing that we are developing now, it's part of the innovative financial instrument, and it's also attracting the private sector investment. So if we could combine these four strategy, so we will have confidence, levels of confidence, high level of confidence that we could finance all the committed climate action in our NDC. Because the NDC, it's not only talking about what will government do, but it's how and what the nation, the country do, including the government, party stakeholders, and the non-party stakeholders, which are the local or central and subnational government, business entities, communities, non-government organizations, communities, and other stakeholders.
Tapi ganti namanya perlindungan ini.
Halo.
Silakan Bu. Tadi ada ini.
Okay.
Back sound. Silakan.
So developing the okay, I cannot see my developing the regulations. It's mean a lot for us in the government, because it's mean that we are managing public needs and expectations. I'm just would like to underline that these regulations, the carbon pricing regulation, um, uh, is developed to be able to fulfill the public needs and expectations. So there are 6 at least needs and expectations that we are identify. First one is a legal basis for strengthening the NDC support. Here you can see there is the NEK, NEC, is an abbreviation for carbon pricing for Indonesian. So nilai ekonomi karbon. So a legal basis for NDC and the related carbon pricing instrument that can support effort to achieve the NDC targets. So we have to ensure that the regulation that we are now prepare is provide a legal basis for NDC implementation, to strengthen the NDC implementations, as well as the carbon pricing instrument to support the achievement of NDCs. And the second is to provide guidance on the governance of the carbon pricing implementation in Indonesia. As much as we would like to have a fast and a broader carbon pricing implementation in Indonesia, but we have to have a guidance. So the implementation of carbon pricing in Indonesia, it's meet a certain levels of good governance. And the third is providing the corridors to restructure the ongoing carbon pricing activities. We all know that we are not starting with a very empty, clear, clean, white paper, because here and there, since the beginning of the UNFCCC implementation, the instrument carbon pricing has been there. And including in Indonesia, we already have the clean development mechanism project. We also have a bilateral joint credit mechanism. We have numbers of projects that already engage or being contract with the voluntary carbon schemes, that kind of thing. So there are ongoing carbon pricing activities and initiatives in Indonesia. So for that, we need to provide corridors to restructure and to ensure that the ongoing initiative will be in line and aligned with the NDC strategies and achievement of the targets. And the fourth is provide incentive option for the well-behaved stakeholders that also taking part in controlling the climate change, mitigation and adaptation. And the fifth is to provide the legal basis for application of innovation environmental funding instrument. Yes, as I mentioned, that we also would regard this carbon pricing initiative as a part of the innovative environmental funding instrument. And the last one is to support the performance of environmentally friendly business activities in the applications of numbers of financial instruments, including bonds or Sharia bond or sukuk, blended finance, and others. So these 6 areas of public needs and expectations are the what you call it, goals, or well, we are using these 6 to test the draft, whether or not the draft is enough to provide corridors to restructure the ongoing carbon pricing activities, whether or not the draft is enough to provide a legal basis for the application of the carbon pricing in Indonesia. So this six needs and expectation is important. So should colleagues have different or other public needs and expectation, I would like very much to hear from you during this opportunity. Okay, no, I think I have a, okay. This is my last slide. So the substance of the draft of economic value of carbon or carbon pricing or nilai ekonomi carbon is regulated in the mainstream to fulfill the obligation to contribute to the NDC. Yeah. And of course, it's also related in the effort to develop the low carbon development in Indonesia, low carbon development. Because as you may already aware that in the midterm, the document of the midterm national planning, government of Indonesia is also commit toward low carbon development strategy. So the carbon pricing is also expect to contribute to the effort in achieving the low carbon development in Indonesia. And the component of the draft as follows. So far, we are now in the I don't know, it's more than 20 draft already. So because we are starting drafting since the last year, well, November or December 2019, and it's very dynamic. No, at least we have 10 chapters on the current draft, but still, it's still tentative. It's still on discussion, but in general, the draft include, of course, we have the first chapter. It's the setting the glossary or all the definitions and working definitions that we are using in and general provision. In the next in the second chapter, we have the goals, objectives, and scope of the regulation. And we also have the provision on related NDCs related NDCs features that to the carbon pricing. So to be able to have the carbon pricing in Indonesia, we need to have baseline, to have target, quota, that kind of thing. So we draw this provision from our NDC and put it into the regulations. We also have a dedicated chapter on implementation of economic value of carbon or carbon pricing. And within this chapter, we are promoting or the regulations promote at least 4 type of carbon pricing. The first one is carbon trading, including the cap and trade and carbon offset. The second is carbon levies. We still are under discussion with the Ministry of Finance. And the third is result-based payment. And fourth is a general provisions. We open a possibility for other type of mechanisms that may need to be developed later. It's really depend on the development of methodology or technology. So we have the provision to also enabling the regulation to to be more flexible in adapting the future or further development of carbon pricing mechanism. We have a chapter for transparency framework. Well, we call it control and supervision instrument like MRV. The SRN is the National Registry System, Sistem Registrasi Nasional, and certifications. These regulations will mandate the government to develop Indonesian emission reduction certification schemes. So we will have the Indonesian certificate later on. So we also have a transitional provision, as I mentioned before. We would like to provide a corridors for the ongoing carbon initiative Indonesia. So there will be a specific provision to for all the transition arrangement, and of course the closing. And the draft schedule is projected to be completed this August. Well, in fact, we in parallel, we have a team who draft the regulations, but we also already established communications with the state secretary and other related agency who will later convey the interagency dialogue and to ensure that this regulation is aligned and in line with other regulations. Thank you, colleagues. This is all that I can share with you. And as I mentioned before, looking forward to hear from you. And I really appreciate and thanking this opportunity. I'm sure, I believe that all inputs will be very benefit and useful for improving the ongoing drafting of the presidential regulation on nilai ekonomi carbon. Thank you, and I give back the microphone to Ibu Kuki.
Thank you so much, Ibu Ami, for your presentation, and it's really good to see in your presentation that the process is currently going on, and I believe that colleagues at the Ministry of Environment and Forestry are working very hard to basically to make this timeline materialize, which will be August this year, right? So hopefully after that, then we can go to the interministerial consultation and further process. So Ibu Ami, there are some questions that addressed to you. I will just take
in a chat room. Okay, I'll
in the
check
chat
the chat room. Okay.
Okay, so maybe one of it, I think it's good to hear also your response on what kind of carbon that will be subject to the presidential regulation, whether it will only be those generated from RED plus and forestry issues, or it's also from energy sector and others as well. So
okay,
yeah.
Should I respond directly, or are you gonna to say another questions?
Yeah, and another one is I think on the issue of energy from waste, whether there is a possibility, whether there is a possibility to prioritize energy from waste in our NDC. So yeah, and I think maybe those two first, and then we can go to other questions later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the questions. As I mentioned before, we need to I think I need to recall you that in the beginning of my presentation, or I mean during on my presentation, I keep saying NDC from time to time, and said that this carbon pricing regulation is meant to help the stakeholders to achieve the NDC target. So for sorry that I did not explain in details what in our NDC, but just to remind you that within the NDC we have five sector priorities. It's forest and land use, energy, IPPU, agriculture, and waste. So those five priorities are, I mean, all carbon from those five sectors are part of this regulation. So it's not only the REDD. REDD will fall under the result-based payment arrangement. I mentioned to you that we are promoting four mechanisms: the carbon trading, the result-based payment, carbon levies, and other future mechanism. So REDD plus, it will go to the result-based payment categories, while other yeah. So I think I respond to one of the question already. And the carbon, it's not only from the forest, but for energy, from the waste, including waste to energy, from IPPU, from the agriculture, and from the energy, of course. So five areas of NDC will cover. I mean, all carbon from all five sectors in NDC will be part of these regulations. And we also need to bear in mind that the NDC is also what you call it? It's not a dynamic, but it's a living document, and there is a mechanism to update the NDCs. So for now on, we have five sectors, but later on, maybe we will have, or we will broaden the sectors to include other sectors. Thank you, Ibu Kuki.
Thank you so much, Bu Ami. Ladies and gentlemen, I think as we have like quite limited time, I know that there are some other questions, so I will try to address it later after all presentations and some clarification from presenters after this. But if Ibu Ami also has the the time to respond to the questions in the chat window, that would be very helpful also, Bu.
I'll try my best.
Okay, thank you, Bu. Thanks so much, Ibu Laxmi, for your presentation and sharing the information with us. I would like to now invite my colleague Angela Kalhauge from Angela is from the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, right, Angela?
Yes, Cookie.
Yeah, so you want to control your presentation by yourself, or should I do it for you?
I'll share it from here, since I've made a couple of changes to the presentation,
okay,
if that's okay. Yeah.
Yes. So please, you
Okay.
can do that then.
So let's do this. Share screen. There we go.
All right, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, clearly.
Yep.
Okay. So thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon to all of you in Indonesia. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you too in this discussion. And it really is a pleasure to be part of a conversation with you on how to engage the broader stakeholder base in the whole discussion around carbon pricing. I must say it was a fantastic first presentation that really gives a lot of insight to what's being planned in Indonesia. So I think that's one of the reasons I made a couple of small changes in my presentation, because I realized a lot more has been done which then gives a good basis to start thinking about how do you then further enrich that process. So my presentation is going to be in two parts. The first one is I'll give you a snapshot of what's happening around the world in terms of carbon pricing, taking some of the key issues that we've highlighted in a report we prepare each year, which is the State and Trends of Carbon Pricing report. And then I will summarize what have we learned from these different initiatives in terms of how to plan and implement good carbon pricing programs. So to start us off, when we looked at what has been happening in the last year, we are presently at 61 carbon pricing initiatives around the world, of which 31 are emissions trading schemes and 30 are carbon taxes. These initiatives span 46 national jurisdictions and 32 subnational jurisdictions, because the subnationals are mainly within the Northern Hemisphere, in Europe and in North America. Of these initiatives that are ongoing or planned around the world, they cover about 12 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is about 22% of global greenhouse gas emissions. While this is a significant progress since we started tracking what was going on around the world, it still falls short of where we ideally need to be in terms of global coverage if we're to deliver on the Paris objectives. Now, one of the things that is getting a lot of attention in the last few years has been the role of these initiatives in generating revenues. And when we looked at what was happening around the world last year, about 45 billion was raised through these carbon pricing initiatives. Again, while this is a positive development, it's more of about 11 billion from the year before. It still falls short of what is actually spent each year on fossil fuel subsidies. And therefore, there is, of course, significant room to close that gap. So in essence, you could say that 2019 was a year where there was expansion in carbon pricing. While we didn't see many new jurisdictions come to the table, what we did see was more, should I say, refinement of the details within these initiatives and an expansion of the scope of some of the existing taxes or markets. Firstly, some of the jurisdictions had started considering complementary measures, which basically took them beyond the coverage of the existing scope, which enables them to reach their mitigation targets. So for example, in Europe, you had Germany, Austria, and Luxembourg planning for carbon pricing for sectors that are not included in the EU ETS. And the announcement of the EU's new Green Deal with its commitment to reach neutrality by 2050 has, of course, strengthened the case to expand the scope to new sectors. In Latin America, Mexico introduced its, or rather launched its pilot carbon market, which is a first for the region, and this will operate alongside its carbon tax. We also saw the climate change laws being established in Chile and Colombia, which will lay the groundwork for a carbon market that could be implemented in conjunction with some of the pre-existing taxes. The second observation from the last year is that the reach of these initiatives is growing. We're starting to see more sectors and gases being covered, and the thresholds are being lowered to regulate more companies. So, for example, in Chile, in Iceland, New Zealand, and in Switzerland. And in the northeastern states of the US, the Cap and Invest program is being explored to be able to be used to drive down emissions in the transport sector. We are seeing some expansion across country and state lines. The Swiss and European markets are officially linked, so we're seeing more interest in the question of aligning initiatives and linking them. And then a question of carbon border adjustments is on the table. And for those who have been following the COVID recovery package discussions in Europe, one of the outcomes was to look at the border tax with the EU, with the European Commission being tasked to come up with a proposal within the next year. So despite all this progress, what we do find is that prices do remain substantially low. And of course, this one would always ask, what basis do you decide whether price is high or low? Right now, half of the emissions are covered by prices that are less than $10 per ton. And this is far from what has been recommended by the Stern-Stiglitz Commission, which was an expert commission that the CPLC brought together in 2017 to try and assess what level of carbon pricing would be necessary to deliver on the Paris objectives. And that study found that levels of between $40 to $80 by 2020 and 50 to 100 by 2030 would ideally drive down the prices. But I think a little caveat on that is that while carbon prices, explicit carbon prices are low, the effective carbon rates in some cases are higher because of all the complementary policies that effectively also imply a cost on the carbon. So this year we also looked at the question of carbon credits mechanisms. We used to look at this previously when we had the state and trends of carbon markets, which was the initial, the pre-report to what we do now, that is looking at the broader policy and regulatory frameworks. And we used to look at that in the early days of the CDM up to about 2013. And now with a growing interest in crediting markets, we have reintroduced that into this assessment we do each year. And what we have found is that the CDM and JI still are responsible for about 3/4 of the credits that have been issued to date. In the last few years, we've seen a growing interest in crediting in forestry, and with about 40% of the credits being generated coming from forestry. And this actually signals the growing interest in nature-based solutions, expanding the discussion to also look at the broader role nature plays and how we can use different instruments to unlock the full potential, both for mitigation and resilience. The demand has been changing there, not only from demand driven by international compliance, but also by some of the domestic schemes, as more countries are also considering credit schemes as part of their overall mitigation plan. And it was interesting to see in the preceding presentation, the fact that you're looking at a broader basket of measures that includes not only the cap and trade, but carbon offsets, results-based payments. So the growing interest in terms of the domestic schemes is also one of the reasons that's driving the demand. I will close on the review of last year by also highlighting that beyond the use of the ETS and the carbon taxation, we're also seeing a very big interest in internal carbon pricing. And this is where companies or governments are using, excuse me, a price to be able to shape their internal investment plans. And in 2019, about 1,600 companies around the world disclosed that they're using or they anticipate to use an internal carbon price within the next 2 years. And many of these companies are using this to monetize the GHG emissions associated with their own decisions, and therefore give them a projection of what their long-term climate risk outlook is. The growing interest of the financial sector, thanks to the recommendations of the Financial Stability Board, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, has also, should I say, contributed to the momentum, because as more investors are starting to assess the long-term risk of their portfolios, the role of carbon pricing in enabling those assessments and lowering the risk in different markets is also becoming critical. So from that perspective, it's very clear that in all these jurisdictions, the value of using pricing instruments, regardless of the form they take, is gaining a lot of political and social attention, not least because they can lead to generating significant revenues for the governments, but also because they do translate in effective investment signals and contribute to driving innovation. We know that through the use of carbon pricing, we can reveal the real cost of mitigation in ways that are less affected by lobbying, that there's much more objectivity, and as such, help help markets set prices that will help achieve the target. Furthermore, carbon pricing can help facilitate international cooperation, and this could be through the alignment or linking of systems, which could be carried out independent of even the international processes related to NDCs or Article 6. We know that when you're using a common trading unit, domestic markets can link and form the basis of international markets, and therefore a lot of the consideration happening in countries is also highly relevant for the international actions that could be taken. And then lastly, and most importantly, especially in the case of many developing countries, is the value that carbon pricing brings to other local and regional benefits, for example, air pollution management, generating new opportunities for jobs, and of course, increasing overall efficiency. So when planning, when we look at all these different initiatives around the world, we do find that while they vary in terms of the types that are being implemented, whether they're ETSs or taxes or hybrid systems that actually combine with offsets, and where they do vary also in terms of the degree of ambition, the kind of tax base, where in some jurisdictions the tax base is the fuel, the carbon content of the fuel, while in others, for example, in Chile, it is the emissions, variations in terms of the institutional infrastructure. A number of questions are normally addressed in the process of assessing what instrument is best. For example, you'd be thinking about what are the national circumstances, what is the national context, what is the structure of the economy, and which are the main sectors that you would be targeting. You'd be thinking about how you intend to use the price, because while we do discuss this very much in the context of mitigation and emissions management, some of these instruments may actually have a primary goal of generating revenues. And therefore, one would be looking for much more, let's say, revenue certainty in terms of within the setup. Questions around what role the price would play, whether it is primarily for the achievement of the NDC target, how this would interact with other policies, and lastly, what other systems do you have or processes that you would need to adapt? So all of these are questions that come into play when thinking about the specific technical design issues. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight out of this were more the principal elements, which is that regardless of what design you choose, it is really important to have a set of key guiding principles that enable you to at least provide clarity on the context. And these, of course, have been based on our assessment of the different initiatives around the world. So this is what we highlight as the key principles for successful pricing. We call them the FASTER principles, and FASTER being the acronym that stands for fairness, where prices reflect the polluter pays principle and contributes to distributing costs and benefits equally to avoid disproportionate burden on some stakeholder groups. A standing for the alignment with other policies. I think the recognition that we are already working in a context where other policies and measures already exist, and therefore introducing any form of carbon pricing would need to be able to engage and complement and not be undermined by other existing policies. So alignment and coherence is really important. Stability and predictability, which would give consistent and credible and strong investment signals, which enable stakeholders, especially those who would be regulated by the pricing initiative, to be able to plan, preempt, and respond in a timely manner. Transparency, which of course is a key issue, especially when trying to engage with a broader stakeholder base. What we have found is that the successful carbon pricing policies around the world are clear in the design and implementation. And to enable this, it's really important to ensure that there is early and regular communication with stakeholders. And therefore, I think meetings such as this one that you have organized is a really important part of the context of ensuring transparency and stakeholder engagement. The next two issues, two principles, are the principles of efficiency and cost effectiveness. Since carbon pricing is aimed to encourage emissions reduction at least cost and give entities flexibility to choose how and when to reduce emissions and their own assessments, having this clearly defined at the outset is really important. And lastly, the reliability and environmental integrity of the initiatives that when implemented, they will actually result in the drive down of emissions, and the comprehensiveness of the instrument will ensure that we're not shifting emissions from one sector to the other, but that the total impact is as envisaged. So therefore, the choice and design of the pricing instrument really will matter for the environmental outcome. In many countries, and we have noticed this, I just want to highlight these two elements which are already implied in the FASTER principles. One is a question of the distributional impacts. Given that within the last 2 years, we have seen that the discussion has moved from one that was primarily within the remit of governments to the broader society. And it becomes very clear, like as in with any other policy issue, the political and local contexts are absolutely key. We saw social unrest in some jurisdictions, and one of the things we learned from that is that while carbon pricing policies or carbon taxes were touted as some of the reasons for social unrest, they in themselves do not trigger that. The trigger normally is the interaction with other social dynamics, which may result in unbalanced burden on some vulnerable communities, for example, through loss of jobs, loss of livelihoods, increase in the cost of living. And therefore, in the design of carbon pricing, special attention to some of the low income and vulnerable communities, especially those who will be affected by the climate transition, if they're, for example, operating within emissions intensive sectors like coal mining, is something that is important to keep in focus. Carbon pricing and how you use the revenues can be designed to be progressive. We know that in some jurisdictions, there has been some clear earmarking on the use of the revenues, while in others, the revenues have been directed into their national budgets. But the key in both cases is clear communication on how revenues can be used or how the particular policy measures will actually drive the envisaged change. And then, as mentioned earlier, and also in the context of what we're doing today, continued stakeholder engagement to consult and engage and discuss where the opportunities and challenges are and what kind of solutions could be envisaged. The use of analytics and modeling to understand impacts can also help address these issues. The other element that we've also found that comes up quite a lot is the question of to what extent carbon pricing programs would impact the competitiveness and productivity of industry, especially those who are expected to be regulated. And we do know that due to different carbon pricing levels across jurisdictions, there's a risk that some activities may relocate to areas with a lower carbon price. This is what we refer to as leakage. And this could actually impact the competitiveness of domestic industries. But what we have found is that one, due to the general low carbon price levels around the world, and secondly, because of the increase in the coverage of carbon pricing across all jurisdictions, there has been little evidence of leakage. Another factor, of course, is that when introducing a carbon price, it's never introduced on its own. And what we have seen is that many governments have thought through some of the mitigating factors to be able to enable a smooth transition as they introduce these over a period of time. And through some of those measures that they take, they're able to address the immediate concerns while supporting industries to make the transition. And some of the options that are usually included within the design are issues like free allocation of emissions rights to some of the vulnerable industries, giving some exemptions, and also providing, should I say, support for innovation and diversification within the initial stages of the implementation of the policies. And then lastly, absolutely important point is how do we communicate the carbon pricing policies and measures? This needs to be built in to the entire process from the beginning through to the implementation. And the narratives and storylines need to be based on the values and also the concerns of the audience. We did an assessment in the last year that was looking at where has communication worked and where has it failed. And we found that a narrative that was based on limitation, that talked about constraints, did not work well and was not sustainable over time. However, a narrative that basically brought forward the benefits of action tended to be much more successful. And therefore, while making the case around emissions reductions driven by carbon pricing can be a challenging, is a benefit, it can be challenging to communicate because the benefits are not always immediate and visible to the stakeholder groups that are being targeted. So therefore, it's really important to focus on how to craft narratives around the core benefits of the measures being used, how they relate to immediate priorities within the short term, to the broader community, to the sectors and the industries, and also to the other parts of government that need to be part of the conversation. So in essence, this was some of the big lessons that we have drawn out of the assessment or the review of what is happening in different parts of the world. And I think my colleague Verania from UNDP, who will be speaking after me and who is leading the Partnership for Market Readiness work in Indonesia, would be able to provide at least a bit more context on how then this applies to the situation in Indonesia with regards to building the capacity towards carbon pricing instruments. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. So we still have some time. There are some questions that being addressed to Angela as well. The first one is on the carbon tax. The carbon tax is not preferred by anyone. Basically, no one likes tax, right? So Professor Jeffrey Sachs suggests to use the proper regulation rather than carbon tax. So what do you think about that, Angela?
I always like to answer that question with, it depends. A carbon tax, again, it depends on what is it that a jurisdiction is after. If you're after putting in place a measure that will give you a degree of cost certainty, and you're after working with an administratively simpler process, because when it comes to the use of taxes and other fiscal instruments, you can use more or less the same infrastructure you would use for other taxation, then a tax tends to be something that could be preference. We see that many, especially developing countries, do intend to start with taxation, but how to make taxation more palatable to people depends on the extent to which you can actually relate the revenues collected to the benefits that will be generated. So this is where the question of having transparency, having clear information on, communicating the utility of the instrument, and involving people to understand how it will be governed, how it could be recycled back through whether it's rebate programs or other social programs, then does help increase the acceptability of taxes. But I think the point really is that whether you call it a tax, I think there is, of course, a semantic barrier sometimes. I mean, even here in Sweden, where we do have pretty high taxation, we do find that the resistance will always be there when you talk to people about taxes or any form of charges. So there is a semantic element. We have seen in the United States, people will talk about a carbon charge. Sounds better than a carbon tax, and yet it might be the same thing. But the underlying principle is giving clarity on what the use will be, how to redistribute the revenues, and how this will contribute to the actual objective that is being sought.
Okay, thank you. And there is another question though on the, this is for both Angela and also Ibu Laksmi. The question is, RED Plus is included under Article 5 of the Paris Agreement. So this implying that it is not on, it is only eligible for result-based payment and not for Article 6. What is our comment on that, Angela?
Well, right now, I can't really speak to where we are with Article 6. I know there is quite a lot of discussion in the broader context of the nature-based solutions and starting to look at how we could use markets also to deliver on that. We did a study about, I think it was last year, together with AITA, and I can share the link with everybody, looking at the value of Article 6. And in that study, there was a modeling done around how much can you actually increase the effectiveness of the market and how much can you generate in terms of revenues if you include forestry. And we found that it was actually a very significant part of the investment that could be transferred if you actually brought some of the forestry projects under Article 6. But at the end of the day, as long as we don't have the final outcome in what Article 6 will be, I think at this point, I would like to say that I'd leave that to the negotiators, but the potential is there that emissions through reduced deforestation can actually be brought into the market with effective market design and can actually provide a very effective way of reducing emissions in the long term.
Thank you. One question, I think, Angela, if you still have time, right? Just for another question. And then maybe further question will be addressed to you later. I'll email it to you. But another question is, for the country like Indonesia, what kind of carbon pricing policy that would you suggest?
Okay, I don't think that's for me to suggest one policy or the other. I know that, and Verania will talk a bit about what has been explored in the broader context of carbon pricing, the market readiness work. I think for a country like Indonesia, what you should be looking is for something that would actually not only drive down emissions in the sectors where you see emissions growing, but that could potentially also generate significant revenues to invest in other low carbon activities. Now, I think we heard from our colleague from the ministry that you're looking at a whole range of instruments. So I don't think it's a question of whether it is one carbon pricing policy over the other. I think at the end of the day, what you should be looking is for something that resonates with the country's priorities, that can be implemented on the basis of the existing capacities, where you do have sufficient data to support the implementation, and where you also have the technical capacity to be able to ensure that it is implemented. So I really don't think we could say one or the other. I know there is consideration of cap and trade. I know there is a conversation around a tax. There's discussions around potential offsets because of the very rich economic basis that the country has across different sectors. So I think it's just important to really look at what is going to be fit for purpose in that context.
Thanks so much, Angela. And I think we should move to the next presentation. And thanks, Angela. I disturb you early in the morning. Like it's still early for you, but yeah, thanks again. And I would like to invite Mbak Rara to share from UNDP perspective on the carbon pricing and also what have been done by UNDP in this issue. You want to share your screen by yourself, Mbak?
Yeah, Mbak Kuki.
Okay. So please, I think it's already on, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to share the views of UNDP. And good afternoon, everyone. Selamat sore, Bapak dan Ibu sekalian. So first of all, I would like to put the context on why UNDP is actually discussing about the carbon pricing in Indonesia. So UNDP, under the Partnership for Market Readiness Global Program led by the World Bank, is the implementing partner or the delivery agent in Indonesia. So the PMR Indonesia is implemented by UNDP, and the government partner is the Coordinating Ministry for Economic Affairs. Our partners in the implementation of the PMR projects include Bappenas, Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Environment, Forestry, Ministry of Industry, and PLN. Because the PMR project in Indonesia focus in power sector and also in industry sector. So this is just a screenshot on how the PMR has initiated the discussion on the carbon pricing in Indonesia since the kickoff in March 2017. Even before the Article 6 become very famous. And we started with the profiling study of greenhouse gases emission in the energy sector, the power sector, and also the industries, particularly in fertilizer and cement industries. And then started the study on market-based instruments. The market-based instrument study include different kind of instruments, the ETS, carbon credit, carbon tax, and also cap and trade and other mechanism. And from there, the study shows that actually what kind of market-based instrument that's appropriate for the power sector and industries. And we started engaging the ministry deeper on how actually to start developing the method, the MRV guidelines for that, and starting the piloting. And the work to start the engaging, as Angela said before, capacity building and engagement of stakeholders should be a continuing process. And we could see that is really important to increase the awareness. And we are really glad that the Ministry of Environment and Forestry now take the actions to the bold leadership on issuing the carbon pricing regulation. So this is our quick assessment on assessing how actually the situation in Indonesia regarding the readiness and the gaps that still exist towards the implementation of the carbon pricing. Here, if we use the categories referring to the OECD building blocks for market readiness, and seeing how actually the current condition and the gaps that still need to be addressed by the government through the regulations that is going to be issued and operational soon, expectedly. So if we could see here, they are the building blocks on the top of the row. This is regarding the potential of sectoral mitigations. First, it is important for the country to understand what is actually the emission profile of the sectors and what are the options, the low cost options in those sectors. If I see the questions, for example, in the chat box, so the there are more information that can be provided in other sectors, in addition to, for example, the power sector and industries that PMR has contributed. And from that, then seeing the profile, the sectoral emission reduction target is necessary. So in our, in the Indonesia condition, the target is still at the sectoral level, but not yet available for the subsectors. MRV capacity. So where are we with the MRV capacity? So now it is, we see that the institution is already established within the Ministry of Environment and Forestry for the MRV. So that's the current condition. The stakeholder awareness. So this is significantly increased recently regarding the market-based instrument as an instrument for, Ibu Ami mentioned, to mobilize resources in order to achieve NDC towards low carbon development and others' interest to this market-based instruments. So the awareness is already increased. The coordinating market-related policies. Currently, there is a potential regulation that already issued on the environmental economic instruments and the establishment of the Environmental Fund Agency, or BPDLH, that already acknowledge the market-based instrument as one of the authority under the institution. So it's a potential institution to be involved as a market player. The market design. There's already some studies, not only from the PMR, but also others, that is already acceptable and seen potential to be further developed and adopted by Indonesia. Market infrastructure. Unfortunately, in Indonesia currently, no mandatory market infrastructure for ETS and also carbon credit. Piloting. Some pilots already conducted voluntarily for the ETS, for example, in power and industry sectors. So if we compare to what is actually the ideal readiness condition by 2020, when we expect the issuance of the policy for the carbon pricing and also the operationalization of it, there are still gaps that needs to be addressed in order to achieve this ideal condition. So we need the sectoral mitigation profile. For example, we need more sectors, information of the greenhouse gases emission profile from more sectors that can inform the policy on what kind of instruments that will be suitable for those sectors. And then the sectors need also the regulation to establish the assessment to set up, for example, the cap. And that is still not available for all the sectors. So here we can see that there's still gaps to be addressed, and we acknowledge that the stakeholder awareness gap are still high, and the coordination between policies is also still high. The gaps, the market design, market infrastructure, and piloting. So these are the gaps that we see still need to be addressed by other partners, and also if it can be addressed by the upcoming regulation. So towards the issuance of this carbon pricing policy and its implementation, learning from the process from 2017 until today, we see that there are some important readiness factors that we learn is important to be taken by the government for the readiness of the carbon pricing implementation. So first, it is important to increase the number of the sectoral greenhouse gases profile and also the data, because that will inform which sectors actually should be involved, which sectors to be prioritized. The second one, the study on the carbon pricing instruments and the impacts. So for example, PMR has conducted the study on this impacts from different carbon pricing instruments, but that needs to be updated to the current situation, particularly with the current condition of the pandemic, for example, to make it more feasible for the implementation. Development of the methodology for the MRV, referring to the Angela about the transparency, this is also still needs to be catch up because the methodology for several sectors available, but there are many still missing. Engagement and socialization to the stakeholders, that is definitely important to engage and inform the potential market players to involve in later implementation, piloting, and also the development of the carbon pricing policy. The second point regarding the current development of the carbon pricing policy implementation, our view is that the Ministry of Environment and Forestry needs to take a bold actions and bring in the policy that can explain the legal basis of the carbon rights and what are the mechanisms to transfer the right, because this should address who actually own the right over carbon, who can trade the emission allowance or the carbon credit, for example, if those are among the instruments. Policy linkage, the clarity between different policies of the carbon pricing and the NDC target. Can we trade before or after we meet the NDC? Or can we trade it in parallel while meeting the NDC target? So these kind of questions needs to be clearly explained and regulated in this upcoming carbon pricing policy. Institutional arrangement is also a challenge. It needs, we see that it is critical that the regulation states clearly which ministry has an authority for different steps for the implementation of the market. For the registry system, the MRV, the issuing certificate. So this kind of institutional arrangement is also critical. Implementing regulations. To avoid the delay after the presidential decree issuance, it's important to anticipate from now what kind of ministerial regulations or decrees that will be needed in order to operationalize the carbon pricing policy. So there will be no delay after the issuance of the presidential decree to the implementation. And the last one is regarding the engagement of the potential market players. We see in the chat box there's questions regarding which sectors, how can we deal with these existing voluntary carbon market and so on. And it is good news that Ibu Laksmi from the Ministry of Environment and Forestry already explained that those issues will be addressed as in the draft of the carbon pricing policy. So this is my last slide, but we again appreciate the the bold initiative from the government of Indonesia and the leadership of the Ministry of Environment and Forestry to push forward of this carbon pricing policy. And we believe that this is one of the instruments toward the low carbon and sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mbak Rara. I haven't seen any questions that direct to Mbak Rara. So maybe we will get more questions later, I'm sure. So I will just now want to invite Aryani from South Pole, Indonesia to share also on the role of offset in NDC. So Ani, you can share your presentation by yourself, yeah? Please.
Okay. I hope my voice is clear.
Yes.
And you can see my slide on the screen.
Yep.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting South Pole to this very important dialogue. Thank you to Meti, and also thank you to Ibu Kuki for kindly moderating this session. And thank you for the previous speakers to share your views and also your inputs to this important process. My name is Aryani Amelina, and I'm based in South Pole office in Jakarta. And I would like today to speak. Today about the role of offsets in achieving nationally determined contributions. This presentation is most of them are based on the South Pole position together with ICROA, the International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance, about 18 institutions that are involved in the carbon markets around the world. So first of all, carbon offsets, as we know it, it used to be only to be used for voluntary carbon markets and voluntary uses by private sector, but it's also more recently being used for compliance purposes. So voluntary carbon markets for a voluntary purpose are triggered by, for example, CSR efforts to reduce carbon footprints of a company or a product, mainly through offsetting. Although we also hear more and more new initiatives like carbon insetting and internal carbon pricing and other private sector initiatives to reduce emissions. Offsets are also being used generated through voluntary actions to prepare for future compliance targets and obligations. On the other hand, compliance carbon markets set up by governments to achieve their NDC oblige institutions to account for their greenhouse gas emissions and reduce their emissions, including through reducing emissions on site or their own facilities and their own activities, and imposing a penalty mechanism for the emissions that are above the limit. And also in some compliance carbon markets, offsets are the use of offsets from approved carbon standards to compensate part of their emissions is allowed. In the voluntary carbon market, private sector actors claim mitigation outcomes or reductions from activities or projects in coordination with the recognized carbon standards. You may be very familiar with the VCS and the gold standard, but also there are many other offset producing mechanisms out there, Climate Action Reserve and American Carbon Registry offsets, and other domestic carbon crediting programs which produce offsets, such as the Chinese Certified Emission Reduction Program. These carbon standards will issue verified emission reductions based on their measurement, reporting, and verification, or MRV standard. And the verified emission reduction certificates can be used by private sector to claim for achieving their voluntary carbon neutrality target. In order to do so, the carbon standard registries must retire or cancel or remove the possibility of these credits to be used for other purpose. And the carbon standard baselines, for example, VCS or gold standards, also have their own baselines and methodologies that needs to be updated over time to maintain so-called additionality, or ensuring that emissions reductions achieved by the projects are beyond business as usual. In this sense, they are achieving emissions reductions beyond NDC and supporting the countries in achieving their NDC at the same time. Under compliance carbon markets, as I mentioned, some of the compliance carbon market allow the use for offsets, and these include domestic and international offsets. This policy is observed in domestic carbon pricing programs. For example, in Colombia and South Africa, the carbon taxes are using the carbon standards that are already in place for many years and are proven. But the emissions of offsets that is allowed to fulfill part of the carbon tax obligations are coming from projects in the country. So domestic offsets for a domestic carbon pricing program. And emission trading systems also similarly do allow the use of offsets. For example, the Korea ETS allow, in this case, the CDM-CERs from projects that are owned by Korean companies, and they can be from projects in different type of projects. Offsets are also increasingly being used for international carbon markets. For example, sectoral carbon compliance programs like CORSIA, which is the compliance emissions reduction scheme for airlines. And similar to the voluntary use, the offsets that are to be used for meeting compliance targets have to be retired or removed from the registry for other use in order to avoid double use. The carbon markets and carbon offsetting have been increasingly being used for the recent years. And in the past few years, the demand for carbon offsets has dramatically risen. With the recently, in the last year, FERA, or the owner of the VCS program, reported a double amount of emissions issued compared to the previous year. And they are most recently the producer of the most offsets. And as you can see in the screen, also the offsets transacted in the 2018, there's a range of price, of course, as it's traded in the free pricing market, but the average price that has been observed globally is $2.4 per ton CO2. And 17% of the companies use offsetting as part of their reduction strategy. Typically, these are used to compensate for emissions which are difficult to reduce on site. And these are just some example of a few companies, global companies, who use carbon offsets for their own voluntary use, offsetting, and some of them are already also moving towards insetting or reducing emissions from their supply chain. And a lot of companies, a lot of global companies have made a public commitment also that they will be carbon neutral. And they use partially offsets to achieve this target. Then looking at these numbers, how is it being seen in Indonesia? So in Indonesia, there has been projects developed using carbon standards, particularly VCS and gold standard. These are the example of project types that have been developed around the country by private sector, by NGOs also, not only corporations, but also NGOs who have benefited from the guidance of carbon standards to ensure that their emission reduction projects are additional and also meet the environmental integrity and environmental safeguards criteria. As you can see, there's a big variety in project types, and most of them are
Ini serius banget.
Kenapa? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you, Ni.
Okay. It's also include all of these types of projects are observed throughout the country, and it has helped create emissions reductions project for many communities and many stakeholders. Then, as I mentioned, we have observed the use of credits under these carbon standards for both voluntary use and for compliance use. Then how do we separate the two, or how do we, is there any difference in the policies related to carbon pricing and also NDC? So for the use of offset in the voluntary actions, the integrity is maintained, and NDC is the integrity of NDC is also maintained. First, private sector or corporations or NGOs who own the projects and own the or the people who buy the carbon credits from the voluntary markets, their GHG emissions are not reported or aggregated to a country level, and therefore these are not reported to the UNFCCC. And instead, these voluntary offsets are usually reflected in the company's sustainability report or to the voluntary initiatives or groups. Maybe you have heard of the UNFCCC NASCA. It's a website open platform where people or where you can see companies' carbon neutrality targets and how they are progressing to achieve them. Or they also include them in their external media platforms like websites or social media. On the other hand, the emissions are reported to the UNFCCC by the host country who where these projects are located. And the reductions are not exported to the countries of the corporate or private sector who provides the carbon finance or buys the carbon credits for voluntary purpose. And the emissions reductions are therefore counted once only at the host country level. However, in terms of the use of offset for compliance purpose, so although they come from the same carbon standard, for example, the offsets that come from VCS standard, if they are used for compliance purpose, there needs to be a set of policies and mechanisms at the international level to organize or to regulate the reporting and accounting of these offsets. And for domestic carbon markets, for example, the South Africa carbon tax or the Colombia carbon tax, who allows the PCS credits, for example, there needs to be a national reporting and accounting framework to make sure that there is no double counting in the country at the domestic level. And for the international markets, for example, the CORSIA airline emissions airline emissions reduction scheme, there needs to be an international reporting and accounting framework, which is currently being discussed as part of the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement negotiation. And I would like to reiterate that voluntary actions help respond to the urgency of the climate action and climate finance. As you may have heard, the IPCC made an urgent call for net zero emissions, global net zero emissions by 2050. And although we have seen a lot of countries stepping up and introducing new policies, new frameworks, the global sum of all the NDC under the Paris Agreement are not yet enough to reach the net zero emissions goal. And we need time. All countries need time to increase the global ambition, taking into account national circumstances and also the national policies that are most appropriate. We have seen the rise of compliance carbon pricing mechanisms in the domestic level, and they will increase ambition and achieve NDC, which some allow the use of offsets. And on the other hand, the private sector voluntary action can help also close this global gap and help countries increase the capacity and also increase the climate finance that are generated in the country. So in addition to mitigations benefits, the corporates that are showing or putting in place climate action by voluntarily achieving carbon neutrality target are mobilizing climate finance for immediate emissions reductions and to respond to the urgency of the global climate change situation. And therefore, when the Paris Agreement comes into force in 2021, voluntary actions that are put in place by private sector and also managed by private sector, like the VCS and Gold Standard, they are managed by foundations. These voluntary actions and schemes to reduce emissions needs to play a continuing role to complement a country's NDC efforts in its carbon pricing and also in other mitigation and adaptation actions in order to ensure that the rapid transition that we all need to meeting the Paris Agreement and also to achieve a stable climate for the future is achieved, as we all hope. And that is the end of my presentation. And I would be happy to answer any question and also to discuss, for example, what kind of policies that could be put in place for compliance use of voluntary credits, and also what kind of role voluntary carbon markets can play in a domestic carbon pricing. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Annie. And yes, there are some questions already for you, Annie. I think the first one, I'll just start from the last one. Is Indonesian emission reduction sold to foreign entities as voluntary offset can still be used for our NDC? So what is your response to that?
Yes, so as I included in my presentation, it is the emission reductions that are sold to foreign entities as voluntary offset will be used for their own voluntary targets. So it's not for compliance, as long as it's not for compliance use. If it's only for voluntary carbon neutrality target, net zero target, these a lot of new initiatives and enthusiasm from private sector are coming. They are still can be used for Indonesia's NDC. So for example, the projects that I displayed earlier, when those credits are used for voluntary purpose, it can contribute to the reductions of waste sector, for example, through the landfill projects, or to energy sector NDC through the geothermal and solar power and wind energy and all. So yeah, that will be my answer. The credits sold to the voluntary market for a voluntary purpose can still be used for NDC.
Okay, thank you. And there is another question. What is your opinion about the implementation of CORSIA and NDC achievement? So how do you see that?
CORSIA for NDC achievement.
Sorry, the potential conflicts or synergies between CORSIA and NDC achievement, because the source of units for CORSIA is still open, right? Or no, it started to be shipped, but there still be some more discussion in the future on that.
So maybe I would just like to share the status of CORSIA right now briefly. In the first phase of CORSIA, it will be for a voluntary purpose, for like pilot phase, for a few countries that are already expressed their participation. And the offsets that are allowed. So of course, like I mentioned before, in compliance market, not only offsets will be used. So airlines are expected to reduce their emissions in-house, so using different kind of fuels or different technologies for their aircraft. And they are also allowed to use carbon offsets. And crediting programs can apply to the CORSIA board if they want to be able, or if they want to be eligible for providing these offsets. And so far, there has been 6 programs that are approved. So VCS, CORSIA, CDM, UNFCCC CDM, American Carbon Registry, the Chinese Certified Emission Reduction Program, the CCER. Let me remember the other 2. It's the, did I mention gold standard already? A Climate Action Reserve, and the Climate Action Reserve. Yeah, that's it. Climate Action Reserve, American Carbon Registry, CDM, VCS Gold Standard, and Chinese Certified Emission Reduction Program, which originally was developed for Chinese ETS, but they are now expanding their market to CORSIA. And the use of offsets from these crediting programs, when they are used for CORSIA, they count as compliance use. So they have to be subject to, maybe some of you have heard corresponding adjustment from the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement discussion. And as some of you also may know, the discussion is very complicated. So I can't say how it will be, how the CORSIA credits will affect NDC so far, but there is a need to prepare for that. I would say that if carbon credits from those standards are sold for CORSIA use, compliance use, how Indonesia should prepare if it is affected by this market. So yeah, that should be a discussion.
Okay, thank you so much, Annie. I'm sure that there will be more questions regarding your presentation, and also because there are quite a number of issues that very interesting in your presentation, but because of the time, I think I would like to invite Casper. Yeah, so maybe you can also share with us, Casper, on the progress and some update on the China ETS. And also you have heard the presentation from Ibu Laksmi. So if you can also share your input and suggestion for our process in Indonesia. Thanks, Casper.
Thank you very much, Cookie, and thanks a lot for inviting me today. It's an honor to be invited and having the opportunity to share some of my observations, mostly on the Chinese emission trading scheme and the Chinese NDC. And I'll try to keep it short because I don't know where exactly your interest lies. So you can just ask me any specific questions in the chat or directly. Let's start with the Chinese NDC and then talk briefly about the Chinese emission trading scheme. So the Chinese NDC is obviously of high importance to the success of the Paris Agreement, given the size of the Chinese economy and China's status as the biggest emitter globally in absolute terms. So China emits around 14 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year, accounts for roughly 1/3, a little bit less than 1/3 of global emissions. So the Chinese NDC is extremely important to the success of the Paris Agreement. Now, the Chinese NDC consists of several different parts with, I think, different importance in terms of actual impact on global emissions. The first one is a commitment to peak emissions by 2030 or earlier, which is, I think, very important because it's a commitment to peak in absolute emissions. The second one is a 20% share of non-fossil fuel generated energy in the overall energy consumption. This one, I think, is the main driving force of emission reductions up to 2030. And then we have a separate commitment to increase the carbon sinks and in the form of forest coverage. In absolute terms, plus 4.5 billion cubic meters of forestry and carbon sinks. And then the last commitment is a reduction in carbon intensity of -60 to -65% per unit of GDP, which is an intensity-based target, and is also the way how China formulates the Chinese domestic policy, which is mostly based on intensity-based targets rather than absolute targets. Now, if China is to achieve its all these targets outlined in its NDC, then the main target is really the 2030 peak, as well as the share of non-fossil fuel sources in the energy system. Because if these two targets are achieved, then by logic, the energy intensity or the carbon intensity target will automatically be met by pretty much by definition. China is on track to meet its NDC commitments. On current projections, we will likely achieve something between 23 to 29% of carbon of non-fossil fuel sources in the energy sector, and the very likely a peak way ahead of 2030. It's interesting to observe that there was an early peak around 2017 when it looked like Chinese emissions already peaked, but then unfortunately there was kind of a backslide in the last 2 years where absolute emissions started to rise again in 2018 and 2019. So it remains to be seen how the reduction trajectory is going to look like up to 2030 and the commitment to the absolute peak in 2030. In absolute emissions, that the current NDC would translate into roughly 11 gigatons of annual emissions by 2030. Many people argue that this is still way too high and that China needs to increase the ambition of its NDC under the Paris Agreement. And it's possible that China may be able to do so, because it looks like typically the way China formulates its NDC and have talked about its less commitment internationally than what China is willing to do domestically. So the way China achieves its emission reductions in the context of domestic policies, in the context of the Chinese 5-year plans. And the Chinese 5-year plans tend to be more ambitious than the NDC. So for example, for the 13th 5-year plan, which with the period from 2016 to 2020, we had a -15% energy intensity reduction target for this 5-year period, which was pretty much met 2 years ahead of 2020. So in 2018, that was already met. And again, for the next 5-year plan, it's very likely that there maybe even be an absolute cap on coal consumption and more aggressive reduction targets than China is willing to commit to internationally under the NDC. The drivers, I think, for this, for China's willingness to commit to more ambitious target domestically, I think, are a combination. It's not just, I think, mitigation of greenhouse gases and to combat climate change. It's also, I think, consideration with regards to, I think, supply of energy and safety of the or energy security, as well as air pollution considerations. As you may know, that China has very serious issues with air pollution, especially in the north of China, and a lot of pressure from the public to improve air quality. So this also flows into climate change related regulation, and it's interesting to see that this shifts a lot of focus of the reduction targets shift, for example, from the power sector more towards transport, and this is important because transport, the share of transport emissions is increasing in terms of the share in terms of overall emissions. So it's now roughly at 5%, but increasingly increasing, and this, I think, this is mitigated by very aggressive targets for electrical vehicles and the policies to reduce the amount of internal combustion vehicles on the road. So now, how does this interlink with China's emission trading scheme? So China has, since 2014, a range of pilot schemes that are operating since 2014, now operating for more than half a decade in a number of provinces and cities. And on top of that, there is a plan to roll out a national emission trading scheme for the entire country, initially starting with covering the power sector and then eventually bringing in additional industrial sectors under the cap. The national scheme is supposed to start this year, but there's delays due to COVID-19. So it remains to be seen whether we see a launch this year or whether that's going to be postponed into next year. But the emission trading schemes and the pilots are in the regional pilot schemes are already very significant in terms of emissions under the cap. So taken together, they're come only second to the European Union's emission trading scheme. So they're quite large already in terms of emissions under the cap. So you have the Guangdong ETS, for example, which is comparable to the Korean emission trading scheme or the Californian emission trading scheme. And we have the Hubei emission trading scheme, which is also 300-something million tons under cap. So it's already quite massive. And the second impact, I think they've already been running for 5 years. So there's lots of gradual improvements and tweaks have been done over time, and people, emitters in these regions, they are more familiar with the concepts, with the MRV cycle, with their reporting obligations and with their compliance obligations. I think success has been mixed. In some regions, it's been more successful than in others. But overall, I think it has massively increased the readiness of all stakeholders to implement an emission trading scheme at the national level. So you have now a fraction of the large-scale emitters who are very familiar already with how emission trading works. You have very important government stakeholders who know how to run an emission trading scheme, who can help their peers in other regions to build up capacity and to support them with the rollout. And you have a national regulator in Beijing who knows how to work with their regional counterparts to implement and to coordinate the different allocations of allowances in the different regions and provinces. So I think there is very valuable lessons learned from the pilots, and I think it really paid off for China to start with these pilots at a very early stage in 2014 to really leverage the experience gained from these pilots and to use all that experience and the infrastructure in the lead up to launching a national scheme for the entirety of the country. So I think looking at Indonesia's NDC and the different range, the wide range of policy options that there are for Indonesia, ranging from carbon tax to cap and trade, thinking about which parts of the economy do you want to look at? Do you look at the power sector? Do you look at other parts, other industry sectors, iron and steel, aluminum, cement, etc., etc. So all these questions, I think that I need to leave that to experts to answer these questions. But in terms of general lessons learned, lessons that China has learned themselves, or learning from experiences in Europe or in the US, I think one thing is start early with pilots. Start as early as possible with pilots. You can limit them, you can make them voluntary, but start with something and then improve the system as it runs. I think that's way more valuable to try to get the thing perfect from the get-go, because that's close to impossible. It's way more important to start early and continually improve what you have in practice. So I think that's one very valuable lesson from the Chinese emission trading schemes. And the second thing is the same as Indonesia. China's been very active under the CDM and with voluntary offset standards. So my suggestion is to leverage the experience that all the different stakeholders have with the CDM, Indonesian DMA, DOEs you have, all the different project developers. They all have a lot of experience with how to measure, how to verify, how to manage emissions and emission reductions. So make use of that and try to use as many existing tools, methodologies, frameworks as possible to reduce the amount of work that you need to invest and to spend your resources efficiently. And then the last bit, I think, is one of the things that China did not do very well. So I hope that Indonesia can do a better job. And I think the fact that we have this webinar today and this interaction today, I think shows that you're on the right track. Communicate often and early and try to be as transparent as possible and invite as many stakeholders as possible to participate in the project and to influence policies and to make sure that they're a good fit. This is something where China is not very strong at. The government, the regulators tend to be very, very careful to provide information why something is still in the process. And then they typically tend to present the final outcome without too much formal stakeholder interaction. And then industry and society pretty much has to just to deal with it. And then they're on the other hand, very good at making tweaks and adjustments later on, but there's no initial feedback and stakeholder consultation very often. And I think it would improve the process dramatically if you increase this kind of stakeholder outreach and stakeholder engagement early on. So I think that's the lessons learned from China. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kaspar. And there are some questions addressed to you though. Okay, let me go to the question again. So the first one is, oh, where is it now? Okay, there you go. What is the key success factor for China in implementing ETS? Yeah, maybe that one first then, please.
Yeah. I think I briefly touched on that already, but to repeat, I think some of the key factors, I think, is experience with CDM. I think that helped a lot. So they, for example, the CCR, the Chinese Certified Emission Reduction Scheme, is pretty much leveraging the entirety of the UNFCCC. The CDM uses the CDM methodologies, uses the CDM MRV cycle. So a lot of that institutional knowledge that was already there has been reused for implementing the domestic scheme. So I think that's extremely, that's one of the key factors for the success. And then I think the second one is really to use pilots to experiment, and not just one pilot. China had 7 pilots initially and then added an 8th one later on. So 8 pilots in different parts of the country, using slightly different approaches, experimenting with different types of legislation, different ways of managing emitters and emissions, and then comparing the outcomes and selecting the best approaches when it comes to designing and implementing the national schemes. I think these are the key success factors for China.
Thanks, Casper. And there is another question. What is the effect of COVID-19 and the up and down of China economy to their ETS implementation?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's quite interesting because the way the Chinese ETS works, I think you can compare it to other ETSs, is where the compliance is so a given compliance period is for emissions from the previous year. So for example, in 2020, as an emitter, I have to comply for my 2019 emissions. So in this year, what we look at in terms of compliance obligations from emitters is the 2019 emissions, which are entirely unaffected by COVID-19. And you see this reflected in the Chinese carbon markets, where there hasn't been a very strong reaction to COVID-19 so far in terms of prices, because emitters are required to comply for the 2019 emissions. Now for 2021, I think that will be the year where we will see the main impact from COVID-19. And regulators, so there will be, I think, impacts in terms of pricing, but regulators have the opportunity to mitigate some of that impact by adjusting allocations for the 2020 2021 compliance period. So this is one of the main differences of China to the more mature markets you see in Europe or in the US, where the majority of the emission or of the allowances that are traded are forward contracts. So in Europe, for example, you trade the 2020 December contract right now, or you can even trade the 2021 contract. So you have a forward curve, and something like COVID-19 will impact the forward curve very directly. But in China, it's entirely spot markets. There is no forward curve in that sense, or it's only over the counter, so much less visible. So you don't see that impact of the future reduction of demand happening right now in the market. So that's something that will still need to materialize in the market probably in the second half of 2020.
Okay, there's another question, Casper, sorry.
Sure.
How do you see the massive investment in renewable energy in China and relation to the NDC and energy transition, to the achievement of NDC and energy transition? I think most of us here talking about renewable and have concern about renewable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, this is really interesting because China has been extremely successful in rolling out renewable energy projects in the last decade. I think initially there's several factors contributing to this. Definitely driven by subsidies initially, then very, very strong cost reductions especially for solar power, and also the availability of land for both solar and wind projects. So I think these factors help to really massively increase the amount of installed capacity in China in terms of renewable, and then also increasing the relative share of renewables within the entire energy mix. Now, this is also one of the main targets under the NDC. So I think this is totally in line with you have perfect alignment between domestic policy and the NDC, I think, which is a good thing. Now, one of the challenges, I think, in more recent years is that the energy agency, the National Energy Agency, and the regulators have been trying to reform the subsidy mechanism, where they want to rely less on feed-in tariffs and want to have more dynamic ways to either subsidize or to stop subsidizing altogether where there is already grid parity, more or less. So the main challenge now for renewable energy projects is not really the tariff, but it's very often it's access to the grid, and there is also curtailments in terms of how much they can feed into the grid. And the way the regulator wants to address that at the moment, it looks like they want to use something like a little bit like renewable energy certificates. So it's a mix between renewable energy certificates and a portfolio requirement. So there is a portfolio requirement for the utilities where they have to have a certain fraction of their installed capacity needs to be renewable energy. But then on top of that, for the grid, there is a target in terms of input feed into the grid, and this part will be managed by renewable energy certificates, which will be awarded to renewable energy projects and then will be handed in to the grid, and the grid company has that obligation to produce the required number of these RECs. This is in a trial stage, so we don't have the details how this is going to work exactly. But what's certain is that it's not part of the carbon market as such. And it's very likely that it's going to be separate from the emission trading scheme and will have an impact. So there is a certain policy overlap between that renewable energy certificate scheme and the emission trading scheme. I think it's very hard to avoid these kind of policy overlaps. So this is one thing to keep in mind when you design your policy, that you try and coordinate between the different ministries, trying to achieve the overall policy objectives of the government.
Thank you so much, Casper. We are at the end of all the presentations and the input from our resource person, but there are still some questions. I think, like most of the questions have been responded directly on the chat, but I think if we still have Ibu Laksmi, there is one question addressed to Ibu Laksmi, if Ibu Laksmi is still around.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Bu. The question is on the carbon assets, Bu. Is a carbon asset a public asset like oil and gas, which is owned by the government, and then the developer are basically becoming the operators only, or will it be a private asset like owned by the developers? Because there is also an issue here, because then the type of or the nature of carbon asset will be will determine the regulatory regime in the presidential regulation. So what is your response on this question, please?
Well, it's very tough question, Ibu Kuki. Oh, I should not turn on my microphone. But let me answer it. We are using assumption and basic principle in developing these regulations. Yeah, and the assumption and the principle was derived from various basic regulations in this country, like undang-undang or act, di Undang-Undang 45, ya UUD 45, Act on Environmental Protection and Management, and many others. So by saying that, I would like to share that we regard the carbon as a public goods, so the government need to regulate this. Like other resources, the resources belong to the country, and through the mechanism in the government, there will be a permit to manage or yeah to manage the resources in a certain well in many type of arrangement. So we are following that kind of approach, Ibu Kuki and others. So carbon it's belong to the state, and it will be given the management or the right to manage the carbon. It will be given through a certain mechanism, including the permitting license and others. So that's how we use how that's how we treat the carbon in this context.
All right. Thank you, Bu Ami. I think I hope this will answer the question. And definitely, we are still, as Bu Ami mentioned earlier, it's still in the progress, right? It's still dynamic. The process is still dynamic. So we'll see with the time, and after August, there will still be consultations with the relevant ministries and also stakeholders, I think, Bu.
Yes, indeed, as I mentioned, throughout the process, especially when it comes to the harmonizations procedures, all the assumption and the basic principle that we are using in drafting the regulation will be exercised, and later on will be decided by the forum or by the process itself. So I'm just share with you the what you call the ongoing process. Yeah. To be honest with you, we are receiving inputs, including how we treat how should we regard the carbon assets in this. We well in uh, in developing regulation in Indonesia, we have a document called DIM, Daftar Isian Masalah, or uh, what you call it, a list of interest or list of questions from stakeholders. So we, together with the draft that we are developing, we also have we also developing the DIM. Which consists all the concern input from stakeholders that we are trying to address later, or not later, or address during the finalizations of the regulations. This carbon asset is part of the DIM already.
All right. Okay, it would be interesting though, and I think there will be also public process where basically not only the ministries but also like stakeholders that also has interest will be able to share their views also to the draft, right?
Yes, basically there will be a public consultations at the next stage, and the public consultation will be held not by the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, but by the other ministries. I mean the state secretariat and that kind of thing. So there will be a process. But I also, as I mentioned before, we are happy to receive inputs even prior to the public consultations, because sometimes colleagues sees that the public consultation it already close to the finalizations. Yeah, maybe it will be less opportunity or space to modify the regulations. So if you have input concerns uh, uh, that to be take into consideration with the team, yes, please share it with colleagues in Ministry of Environment and Forestry, or through my email, or through Ibu Kuki. Then Ibu Kuki know where my coordinate Yes, so I cannot get rid of Ibu Kuki, so you can
Sorry.
you can use Ibu Kuki as a bridging if you would like to. I mean,
That's
sorry, Ibu
fine.
Kuki.
I'm very honored to be the bridge though. Okay. Thank you so much, Ibu Laksmi,
You're welcome.
for your clarification and sharing of information. And we are really looking forward for the process, for the continuation of the process. And as Ibu Laksmi already mentioned, of course, Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, please, if you have input, then I think I will, I will ask Pak Surya, of course, after this, because I'm sure that quite a lot of colleagues here are members also of METI. So maybe METI will also be able to somehow, collect the input and then convey it to the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, I think.
One thing, Bu Kuki, if I may.
Yes, Bu.
All the concern and input, as I mentioned, it's collected and documented by the teams. And we will see whether this input could be fit into the into the presidential regulation levels, or it will be used when we develop the guidance as will be mandated by the regulation itself.
Okay.
Because the regulation will not we would like to have the regulations as concise and implement well, of course, doable and implementable, but maybe not all the what you call provision on how or detailing the mechanism will be put in the regulations at the presidential regulation. It will be later further down at the guidance and maybe ministerial regulations later on.
Okay, so yeah, it's clear. So we can basically give input, and then later on it will be accommodated at the level that it is appropriate, right? Okay, so because it's already 4:30, I think yeah, 2.5 hours just fly. So I would like to invite Pak Surya Dharma to basically close the discussion today. And thank you so much for all the resource persons. Please, Pak Surya.
Yeah, Bu Kuki, thank you very much to all of you, Bu Laksmi and Bu Rara, and from the others, all others speakers. Very interesting topic today, and I think until now we still have 62 people, almost 100 people before, but because of the weekend maybe they left already, some of them. But however, we really, enjoy that we have so many input from, especially from Laksmi, to enrich the what we have to do by the next maybe for the carbon pricing. Hopefully, the peraturan presiden will be issued, and it's better, if together, not only for the carbon pricing, but also for the renewable, all others renewable energy. So we can gather together, and we can, develop together, and hopefully the target of NDC may be reached by 2030, 29%. And thank you again to all of you. And I think by closing this session, and we hope to thanks to all of you, and see you maybe next Friday. We are going to have another session on next Friday. Thank you also to Bu Kuki to moderate this session.
Sama-sama, Pak.
Let me close this session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Kaspar.
all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. Before we close the room, the Zoom room, I would like to invite Pak Paul because Pak Paul has some announcement. Please, Pak Paul.
Thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. Having Ibu Ami in the among the busiest schedule that she has, that's always
It's my pleasure, Pak Paul.
very encouraging. Having Ibu Ami as a minister would be good as well. Hope for the best, Ibu Ami. And then, of course, we thank you, my friend Kaspar. We worked together with at South Pole a long time ago, and to Ani, Rara, and so on, and also to Angela. Please send my regard to Angela, yeah, Bu Rara. But just to announce something, next week we will have again sessions on the renewable energy portfolio standard, as it will be part of our discussion. So the issue that we have to touch in the draft bill on renewable energy, and then we still have some how do you call it, the hazmat coverall in our let's say store. Also, we just received about 20,000 face masks from China. It is let's say donated by our colleague Renewable Energy Society in Chongqing. And for those of you who knows that any hospitals that need these hazmats, we are pleased to send it to those hospital in needs. And for those who, as mentioned by Ibu Kuki, for those who wants to provide, let's say, inputs on the draft presidential regulations on the carbon pricing, please get in touch with us, and then we will let's say we will submit later on to Ibu Ami. Thank you all for the fruitful discussion. Then we will have the summary of discussion later on. Thank you, and good evening, everybody. Have a nice day.
Thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Danke, Kaspar.
Bitte schön. Bis nächstes Mal.
Thanks, Ani.
Thank you, Bu Kuki,
Kaspar,
Pak Paul.
thank you.
Terima kasih Bu
Selamat
Kuki. Kalau ada
Sama-sama.
pertanyaan yang belum sempat saya jawab di chat room, tolong di forward aja. Tadi saya berusaha untuk lihat, tapi karena masih telinganya masih juga dipakai untuk yang lain, jadi mungkin nggak semuanya tercapture. Thank you.
Nanti saya cek lagi.
Thank you Pak Surya Dharma, Pak Paul.
Terima kasih Bu Laksmi.
Thank you Aryani.
Terima kasih Bu Ami.
Dan semuanya, terima kasih. Saya mohon pamit ya. See you.
Iya, Bu.
Ya.
Stay healthy,
Saya juga
stay
mohon
happy, keep the spirit high. Bye. Assalamualaikum.
Terima kasih Bu Yani hadir. Selesai nih Pak. Ya Pak Paul.
Ya Pak Joko.
Tadi sama Bu Inten, saya baru selesai baru masuk sini.
Saya juga dengar Pak. Saya juga ikutan tadi.
Iya. Tapi bagus lah itu.